Come on down. Welcome, everybody. Come on down. Come on down to the lounge. Let's get this going. Sorry for the green screen. With this application, we don't have the choice of masks. So I want to thank you, everybody, for coming out today to our little StartupTech event. We used to host them in person, as some of our members actually do know. We used to host them directly in Ontario, Quebec, and Western New York. We used to love having them in person in Toronto, Kitchener-Waterloo, Hamilton. Love my Montreal. Definitely love my Montreal. But you know what? We haven't had a chance to do that with COVID. And I would honestly definitely say within the last year and ever since COVID hit, we haven't really had a chance to do our events like we did before. So I definitely have slipped on hosting our tech events. We definitely had conversations every single month with founders, more or less one-on-one. So we still have our mentoring sessions, but we really haven't hosted many events. So that's something that we're definitely trying to bring back directly for all our members. Something you're definitely going to see posted directly in Meetup will be these StartupTech founder events, which we're definitely known for, followed up by our Lunch and Learns again. And we're looking to also have our funding events as well. So starting up, I believe in about two weeks, we should have Good News Ventures, where we'll have Mohan again probably coming on and talking about funding. So that's something else that we definitely want to have a little bit more often as well. So you have a chance to, meet and greet and have conversation directly with angel investors and funders and VCs as well. It's one thing to have this misnomer and conversation thinking, I have to do an investment round, but it's another thing when you actually are able to have a conversation directly with them. It's one thing when you're going through, you're bootstrapping your business and, you're going through your daily grind, and another when you actually are able to have a conversation. And I know myself pre-COVID, you're actually able to sit down and, have coffee directly with them and have a deep conversation, and you're actually building a relationship. And I think everything that we try to do ourselves is all based on building relationships. And I think that's the most important thing that we can do. So with that being said, I love having these founder talks because I love learning from other people. I think that's one of the most important things we can do. So with that being said, we're going to be bringing on Jacob. Jacob is actually quite incredible in what he's been able to do. So bear with me. This is definitely not a Zoom platform, so it's a little trickier. I'm going to try to see if I can grab him and bring him into the picture so he can talk to us a little bit more about what he's done with his company and how, let him talk a little bit more about what he's doing. So give me a second and I'll bring Jacob in. Give me 1 second. Hold on for the technical difficulties as I bring Jacob. 1 second. Hey, Jacob, how are you?
Good, we got it. How are we doing?
Fantastic. I'll put my little earphones. I love the ones you have. So Jacob, tell me.
We'll have to get you a pair.
Hey, I'm more than happy to get one. I definitely need a little bit more concentration in my life. So Jacob, tell me a little bit more about your buyer's journey and a little bit more about your entrepreneurial journey as well and how you got involved.
Yeah, so my background, I studied mechanical engineering at McGill. And while I was doing my degree, I was tutoring math and science, as I think a lot of engineers tend to. And I just obsessed with the question of why the people I was teaching, right, they're very smart, they're very driven, and they're failing all of their classes. Like in my mind, something's got to give at that point. And so it led me down this kind of spiral of a whole bunch of stuff. So I launched a kind of SaaS ed tech platform that was this like Khan Academy meets Skype tutoring thing. Miserable failure. Nobody adopted it. The problem that I was solving was just the wrong problem to be solving. And then the following 3 years, I spent kind of researching the psychology of learning, like the process of taking information and bringing it into memory, consolidating it, and then retrieving it. and ended up writing a book on study habits, kind of the psychology of learning applied to
Wow.
academia. And it's in there that I think I really realized that, for most of us, our rate limiting factor when it comes to improving our productivity is our ability to focus. And that led us into wanting to solve the problem that now is Eno. And then after I graduated, I got accepted to the Next 36 incubator. And from there, we put together the team, the idea, started to pitch out the business plan, and it took off from there.
Fantastic. So really, you had this idea of creating this business, and again, why Eno or Ena? How do you pronounce it?
Eno, yeah.
And again, tell me a little bit more about the journey, because again, most of the startups we typically have on, again, are typically just platform based. Again, the fact that you actually have a hardware piece directly to that, and you have hardware and a software, I'd love to learn a little bit more about that process as well. So talk to me a little bit more about, hey, you have an idea, you want to validate it, now you're trying to create a hardware piece. How do you, go along that journey saying, oh, geez, you know what, I want to create this hardware piece. How do you start drafting it out? How do you start going through and creating your first iterations? Talk a little bit more of that journey.
Yeah, hardware, software, and now content. We're doing a content strategy as well, and so we've bitten off way more than we could chew. But that's the part of the fun of it, right? Yeah. So we, like I said, we started in the Next 36. So they accept, they're an incubator based in Toronto. If you're not familiar, they accept individuals on the premise that they can teach you the fundamentals of entrepreneurship and give you some of the space and time and capital to be able to iterate on a business plan. So first thing I did was I found my co-founder. It was a good friend of mine in university. We had complementary skill sets in that I'm much more academic and much more, I think, theoretical. He's much more of a scrappy, hands-on, prototypey kind of guy. And then we set out with this problem that we had, which is like, look, if you go up to people and you ask them, hey, man, describe to me how you relate to your distractions. They'll go, oh my God, I can't, I'm distracted all the time. I can't get off my phone. I have my Slack that keeps nagging me. Distraction gets people talking. And that's a problem, right? That means that it's something that is fundamental to most of us and big enough that it's worth solving. Then was the question of what do you do with that? And so we ended up, we talked to everybody in the space that we could get our hands on. We talked to academics and neuroscientists and psychologists about this problem. And what we realized was there exists a technology that can train you, if you're very distracted, to focus better. It's just locked up in university labs. You need to go in and get a neurofeedback where it costs $600-700 an hour, and they hook up a whole EEG cap and they sense your brain takes an hour to set up, and then they'll run you through these trainings and diagnostics. And what we kind of realized was there's an opportunity to take that technology, trim it down, and democratize it into a form factor, as simple as a headphone that you could just wear during the day to essentially create a Fitbit for your brain. And the following year, once we had that idea, was a process of validating it, of is this actually something that's feasible? Technologically, running the experiments with little prototypey versions, we would buy a pair of headphones off the shelf, we'd stick our sensors underneath it, we'd hold it onto people so that it makes contact, use a little open source, OpenBCI biosensing diagnostic board that we'd hook the sensors up to, read the data to a text file on your computer, and then analyze it. And the whole process would take a month to script out, and then we'd collect a couple hours worth of data and run our analytics to see can we measure these neural states in this form factor. So technically validating it, as well as running through the business plan of, look, why hasn't nobody does this? If we were to do it, what would people pay for it? How many people in the world are willing to pay for it? And I think the most critical of all, does anybody really care? How big of a problem is this that we're actually solving? Is this, a want or a need? And that took us a good year of just playing in the dirt and kind of prototyping through the Next 36. And then once we left there, through the Hacks Accelerator in Shenzhen, to get to the point where we were saying, okay, we know what this product should be, and we're confident that we can build it. And so then we launched our Kickstarter, and from then on, it was a lot more tangible.
Oh, fantastic. So talk to me a little bit more, before we really start talking a little bit more about the Kickstarter campaign, talk a little bit more about I guess, first, number one, pitch the business directly to us, because I don't know if everyone understands really what the product really does when it comes down to the really cool technology behind. It's not just the earphone, but it's how and what the product actually does.
Yeah, so the fundamental, we call it a Fitbit for your brain. So in our headphones here, the ones I'm wearing, I'll show you another copy so you can see it. We've embedded EEG sensors, 2 in the top band that kind of retract into the band here, and then 2 in the ear cups. And those sensors can measure the electrical activity from the upper cortical layer of your frontal parietal lobe. So it's sensing your brain activity as you work. So whenever you put them on, we can detect that they're on, and we'll track from that indicators of your level of focus, your level of stress, motivation, fatigue, cognitive workload, mind wandering. We can get a very interesting picture of how your brain is changing while you work. And so what we want to do with that is essentially a Fitbit for your brain. We want to do for the mental and cognitive health space what Fitbit is doing for the physical health space. So that includes giving you data and analytics about how your focus is changing over time. It includes neuroadaptive content, music that adapts to your brain, coaching and mental health coaching and content, meditations, and a whole bunch more that we've got in the pipeline that we haven't released yet.
Oh, fantastic. So talk a little bit more about this journey. So you come up with a product, you're starting now to iterate, taking your product. So again, typically with software, you go through the MVP stages. Now talk a little bit more about doing an MVP with that actual hardware piece first. So what's that journey like? And then how did you get it to start creating your first, first prototypes and then go into doing your crowdsourcing parts?
Yeah. The MVP stage is a really messy one in our case because you can't MVP a hardware product very often, right? Sometimes you can get a scrappy version of it, but especially consumer electronics like this, the experience won't be as good until it's as good, right? And if you were to, test out a Gen 1 iPhone that didn't have, a screen that was this big, that was barely interactive, it wouldn't be the same experience, and so you're not going to get the same feedback. And so what we needed to do was essentially to break down the value of an MVP into smaller chunks. So we were looking at what are the core questions that we need to identify to justify that this business is worth doing. Number one for us was, is this a problem that if solved would generate, billions of dollars of value? So are we, scratching an itch that matters to people? And we actually, for some companies, this is a core question. For us, it ended up coming pretty easily because if you talk to people about their distractedness, their lack of focus at work, about their mental health issues relating to work, stress, anxiety, they light up and they will go for hours. And almost everyone has a story they can tell about how their life could be made better if they could focus better or they had less stress. And so to us, the problem required less proof point than I think a lot of companies will. And as a result, we were able to skip that stage of MVP. The next question basically just became, how do we solve it and can we solve it? So that's where we spent most of our time. So most of our MVP was a technological proof. It was looking into, can we actually build a product that would take headphones, integrate sensors, measure the neural activity that we need, and then provide some sort of feedback to influence that in the user. And as a result, it becomes a little easier to test out. And so again, I should have loaded up some of our old scrappy prototype pictures I could have shown. But basically, we would buy off the shelf headphones, hook up sensors to it, measure the data in a very controlled environment, and run our analytics to say, okay, if we had this data in real time and our app was working to process it, would we have been able to do what we wanted to do? Those experiments, we ran about 7 or 8 batches, so one every month or 2 months for about a year, until we were confident enough of the conclusions that we were able to say, we can measure what we want to measure, and if we were to have measured that, we could do add meaningful, tangible value to people's lives. It seems we might have lost Brian, and so I think I might be the only speaker here. If anybody else has any questions they would like to drop in the chat, now would be a great time.
No, I'm here. I'm just listening to yourself as well.
Cool.
All I was trying to say right now is, what a better way of doing your market validation is actually taking a piece of hardware. We've seen that before with either people with 3D printers, taking an actual piece and just modifying that directly with another piece of hardware and just doing re-iterations and trying to see what works and what doesn't work. Again, perfect way. Find out what the market wants, see what customers really like or don't like. Beautiful way of doing it.
Yeah, and as a result, because you can use those off-the-shelf components, it turns your prototyping time from like when we do a prototype of our hardware, like a proper iterative prototype, it's like a 3 to 4 month process using the fastest resources we could find in Shenzhen. That's just not fast enough to get the validation you need. And so if you're able to use off the shelf components and kind of, scrap together something that doesn't look good, definitely doesn't feel good, but proves and answers some sort of question that you have, some experiment that you need to be running, it reduces that to, a 2 to 3 week cycle instead of a several month.
Perfect. And then what made you go and run a crowdfunding campaign? So what was your process in actually doing that?
Well, by the time we got to January of, this would be 2017, we knew that we could build the product we wanted to build. And we knew that people had a need for it, that they were demanding it. And if we could build it, it would be valuable. The big question that remained, that there were two of them. One is, how are we going to fund this? Hardware is expensive, and building a proper consumer electronics product takes, $2 to $3 million. And we needed to find a way to fund it, despite the fact that early stage VCs typically won't embark on this risky of a product. And secondly, are people willing to pay for it? Because the difference between solving a problem that people would love to have solved for free and solving a problem that they're willing to drop $400 on is quite significant. And we knew that from the start, that there was a real chance that we would pitch, this Fitbit for your mental health, and people would be like, cool, I'm sure it's great for someone, but I don't have that kind of money. And so the crowdfunding campaign is just such a great way to do both, to find your audience and get them on board, and then to get the money that comes from that to be able to then go and prototype and finish the development.
Perfect. And how did you find running the program for yourself? Because again, we've had conversations before, and I actually ran one of the campaigns for ourselves as well. What was your idea when you first went in saying, oh, we're going to run a crowdsourcing campaign where it's going to be wonderful, it's going to be fantastic? What was your experience and going through it the first time? And actually you were successful, but what was it like? And what were your expectations when you first went in to what happened afterwards, towards the end?
Yeah, so I think my expectations prior to ever thinking about it, just being like, well, we could launch a Kickstarter, was I assumed that virality, that the viral Kickstarter that kicks off, was a thing. And it turns out that's just not the case. The viral Kickstarters are just really well executed marketing campaigns. And so the coaching that we got through the Hacks Accelerator in Shenzhen was a huge help in kind of showing us like, no, if you want to run this, you need to run it properly. And running it is planning a marketing campaign, the size of which will dictate your success. And so we didn't put, $200 into it. We put hundreds of thousands into it in order to deliver on the promise of a marketing campaign at the size that we needed. As a result, we were able to prepare for it. So we got a team together on the graphics design and the website development. We got a videographer, we got a photographer, we got marketing teams, we got advertising teams, and together they were able to put together a marketing campaign that turned into a $1 million+ Kickstarter. And having them do it professionally, I think, did us a service of making us appear significantly more advanced than we were at the time, which I think was helpful for the success of the campaign.
Fantastic. So when you were actually coming together and you're building out your product, so you have this hardware piece. Now, talk a little bit more about the platforms and all these additional auxiliary services that you're building out as well. Because I mean, that by itself, just the additional services, I think, are phenomenal.
Denvir with the question in the chat. Yes, 6 figures. And I think that the success of the campaign is in large part predicated on the fact that we invested a significant amount as a proper marketing campaign. That's the hidden secret of Kickstarter that they don't want to tell you. So to your question, so then once we finished the campaign, that was in March or April of 2017. Then we had to say, all right, cool, let's go build it. And then came a long and strenuous journey of trying to deliver on a promise of building, the world's first brain sensing headphone and kind of living up to the Fitbit for your brain vision. So that started on the hardware side. So we went back to Shenzhen, where we met up with Onkyo, who is a headphone company. They make audio products and amplifiers and such. We partnered with them in order to make sure that they could help us with the audio part, the headphone part, so that we could focus on the neurotech, which is the part that we knew well. And then we partnered up with a factory who does headphones. And from then we were able to work with them kind of through the design iteration cycle at a professional quality that they understand and can deliver on that we didn't necessarily know would be know how to execute on, right? I've never built a headphone before. My co-founder had never built a headphone before, but they've built headphones. And so we're able to follow a lot of their guidance and making sure that we're doing things, the right way and at a scale that we can deliver on to compete with the Beats and the Bose of the world that occur in the headphone space. In parallel, we also had to then finish up the R&D on the biosensing, the ability to measure these neural states. And so that was another 6 or so months of prototyping and just doing, hacking together experiments, and then sit down and say, all right, we also need an app to go along with this, right? And so we fiddled around in the dirt for longer than I care to admit, trying to build our own app and kind of say, well, maybe you could do this, maybe you could do that, before finally realizing, we need to bring somebody on that better understands the design of this software product. And we partnered up with a Montreal firm, 4040, who do incredible work on the UI UX side, who helped us really take what was a concept and understanding, and in my case, a little bit of an expertise on the kind of psychology of learning side, and mold that into a consumerized experience of something that people would want to interact with and that would deliver on the promise that we were trying to deliver on. So identifying, what exactly is the product need and how does your product need to fit within the life cycle of the people that are using it. And it was this really interesting 2 to 3 month exploration of figuring out where we need to put our efforts and what ultimately needs to be the interaction of the individual and their product at the end of the day. So we did that in 2018, and then 2 years following that of just building the infrastructure of the app with the software team back in Montreal here, while the hardware team finished up the hardware.
Fantastic. And now through that whole iteration period, through dealing with the software, did you have any customer interactions, or at that point you really didn't have customers? Did you have anybody that was either testing the software, or how did you go through the R&D even with the software? Any other additional pair of eyes, or?
We did so the lucky part of having run a Kickstarter campaign was we had 5,000 plus backers who had already bought into the product, who were eager for it, who we could use as beta testers. And that was very valuable, right? We did a lot of market research, discussing with our clients, like just, hopping onto Zoom calls or running surveys or anything in between. Look, how do you work, and what exactly is the issue that you're facing, and how could we integrate with this? And every once in a while we'd have a prototype of the app that was really buggy and unclean, but that we could send to them in a dev version and be like, look, can you click a couple buttons and kind of let us know how you feel about this? The big issue, difficulty with our product was that until we had the finalized hardware, it was really difficult to test the entire experience. It's kind of what I was describing before with the iPhone, right? Like if you're to test 50% of an iPhone, it's not really going to live up to the design, and therefore it's very difficult to get a sense of whether this is actually delivering on the promise or not. But where we were able to, I think, circumvent that was by identifying the core issues we were likely to have and really understanding where these touch points would fail if they do, and running isolated experiments with that in our software. So for us, right, the big element is the accuracy of the device. Like people need to be able to put on the headset and have it sensing these neural states and delivering the feedback without any sort of real adjustment, like without having to think about it, right? Very much like you have a Fitbit, you just put it on and you forget about it. So that was number one. And then the second was the gamification. It's got to feel fun to track these neural states. Like you've got to enjoy and get some value out of the stats that you're reading from it, right? These didn't need to be tested as an entire product. We didn't need the whole stack in order to validate some of the assumptions on this. We could do them in much, much more isolated experiments where, for example, we could, have a fake version of the app that we could work with them through and just describe, like, if I were to do this, how would you feel about it in kind of in real time without ever building anything? So we were able to work on the back-end infrastructure that we needed to be able to get the app to be robust enough to be testable at the same time as doing a lot of the testing in much smaller scale, in a kind of much more isolated, controlled conditions, because we sliced up our experience into such small assumptions.
Oh, fantastic! So at least you had that part of that validation, because I mean, typically when you run a typical software piece, you would have your MVP, then you have some kind of early adopters, and then from that point you have at least some kind of customer feedback loop.
Yeah, and I think we would have been better if we could have had more customer feedback in the development process, right? Like we're for example launching, we're shipping 2,500 units this month, and we have about 400 in the wild, and another 3,000 coming the next month. And So we're scaling up very quick. All of a sudden, we're going to be onboarding thousands of users. And we've noticed that we've had some users where we onboard them and they're like, hey, what about this issue? And you're like, oh, that's pretty fundamental to the way we build the product. I don't know how to answer your question about that issue. And then you go back to the drawing board with the design team and start restructuring things that really could have been solved months ago if you just known about it. And it unfortunately, just given the nature of our product, the fact that you kind of need every piece to be working together and to be working at a quality standard that's higher than certain applications, like certain B2B applications, you can have half a product and it will deliver on half the value. But in our case, half the product delivers on almost none of the value. As a result, we were limited in some of the ways that we were tested. So we kind of had to hack together these experimental versions to understand some of the assumptions, knowing that when we launch it, we're going to discover a whole new set of bugs and assumptions that we never could have predicted, but that I don't think we could have fully worked through prior. So it would have been better. It would have been awesome if we could have, finished this product 2 years ago and started MVP testing before fully launching it today. But we had to work with what our constraints were.
Hey, you got to do what you got to do.
Mike, I just want to address one of the comments in the chat. So it's two parts. So one of them is kind of like the Fitbit for your brain. So we're quantifying your level of stress and focus and fatigue and whatnot. We give you stats about that. Analytics that could help you organize your day and better orient your mental health practices and your productivity schedule. So, we'll let you know what are the best hours during the day for you to be working on your most important task, or what apps are you using on your computer that are most stressful, that might be inhibiting your ability to get your best performance. So that's one part. And then the other part is we have content that we're delivering that is neuroadaptive. So the first example we have within our app today is music that you can listen to while you're working, that changes as a function of changes in your brain activity to train your brain to better recognize its own states of distractedness. And that has an active effect that will actually improve your sustained attention by up to the clinical papers show 75% while you listen after just a few sessions. That's my extended pitch.
That's a great pitch. And especially after that, a little deeper explanation directly to the product, it really good into the next question, where it comes down to a little bit more about funding. So everyone goes into these funding rounds, and I don't know how deep you want to get into this conversation, but most founder goes, they go through the standard Series A, through your friends and family, and then you start doing your seed rounds. We went directly and you started doing, you do iterations and you did your crowdfunding. What was your next raise that you basically have done?
Yeah, so we did accelerator stage, then we did the crowdfunding, we did a bit of grants and non-dilutives, and then we did a pre-seed round. So end of 2017, beginning of 2018 was when we did that, and we closed it. It took about 10 months, like a really solid, full, if longer than usual, pre-seed round. We raised that with Real Ventures, with SOSV, two big VCs, and then with a series of angel investors that came on board.
Fantastic. And what kind of advice would you be able to give to any of the founders that we have currently on our call right now? I mean, we don't have that many on this group right now that might be actually fundraising, but just typically for the average founder, what would be some of the advice you could actually impart directly onto them?
Yeah, and actually, for context, I forgot to mention, but we're closing another round now, also as well. So that first round was about 800,000. This will be about 1.5 million, and then we have a planned Series A potentially next year. There isn't really one piece of advice I can impart. Get prepared is generally what I tell people, and the reason is I think there is a perception of what a fundraise is and is not, in the same way that there was a perception of what a Kickstarter is and is not, right? And I know some friends who've launched Kickstarters, and they put out their product. And actually, recently, I launched one for my book before I ever did the Kickstarter for this. And I built the page, and I recorded the video, and I put a lot of effort, and then I got about $1,000 worth of sales, like nothing explosive. And I know a few friends who've done that, and they gotten in the tens of thousands. But if you want to get in the millions, it requires a process. You need to have a structured system through which you're going to execute on this marketing campaign that is the Kickstarter. And a fundraise kind of works the same way. It will take 6 to 10 months the first time you do it, and you're going to have to do it a certain way that will be much more likely to work. And unfortunately, If you don't know how to do that, it's very unlikely you'll trip and stumble through it and result in a successful raise. And so, there's 1,001 really good articles written about this. Venture math is the most important thing for you to understand, just the economics of what are funds looking for, the idea that, they don't want a $10 million company, they want a $1 billion company or more, because their math cannot work any other way. You've got to know all of that before you even start to craft your pitch, because otherwise it's just not likely to succeed.
Absolutely. They're always looking for that. I mean, one of the funniest things when you attend any of the accelerator programs or any of the incubator programs, it's always thinking big. And if you're not thinking big enough, I remember the conversation is you're always it's a lifestyle business. It's not interested. It's a lifestyle business. And it kept on pissing off so many individuals that are inside the business going, it's $1 million or a couple $1 million business. And they're like, yeah, it's still a lifestyle.
And that was the funniest thing is I had this vision of, the stereotype of Silicon Valley, where like your classic Silicon Valley bro who's like always talking about big vision and bragging about the billions of dollars are going to change the world. And I thought that was a stereotype, but it turns out it is an economic incentive. It turns out that the only way this system can work is if you think that way, and not thinking that way isn't going against the grain. It's not understanding the economics of the game that you're playing. That was a hugely insightful learning in the accelerators. The other one is reasonably, I think the best way to understand that, go talk to a VC, pitch them and tell them like, look, I don't expect you to give me money, but I really need to know what I don't know that is like problematic, because we're hoping to raise $1 million in, a year and a half or even 6 months. And I'm naive and I need your help. And they will tell you right off the get-go if what you're doing makes sense or not, or they'll tell you, oh, you don't even know how wrong your pitch is, and you need to go back to the drawing board. We've had that a few times where we're like, okay, well, thank you, that hurt, but I appreciate the feedback.
Well, what was some of the most important things that you learned directly through when you were pitching? Because again, you always tend to learn some nuggets, and like you said, sometimes it is rough to sit back and, I'm not going to say you get brutalized, but they're very, very honest. Either they really don't understand, they're very to the point. But what was some of the most important feedback that you've received? And maybe you can sometimes impart some of your advice that you've gotten or regurgitate that directly to some of our members as well.
Yeah, the most recent feedback I've gotten in this current race has been feedback that I got intangibly kind of reading through the lines from a lot of the rejections that we got, which was when you talk to, again, like the problem we're solving, right? Do you want to focus better? Ask that to anyone. They're like, oh yeah, of course. And if you want less stress at work, they're like, yeah, that'd be amazing. And we're like, great. Literally everybody is our target market. There are 400 million knowledge workers in the world. If every one of them buy our product, that is hundreds of billions of dollars. Case closed, the market's big enough. And then we go and we pitch this product. And we got a lot of rejections, basically people being like, you know what, I just don't think you're going to sell enough of them to be worth our time. And I'm like, oh, why? That doesn't make any sense to me. Like everyone and their sister could benefit from this kind of product. And I finally went and downloaded the research papers showing the economic analysis of the different markets we're playing in. And it turns out consumer mental health wellness is like a $2 billion industry. Like everyone's talking about it. It is a hugely in vogue concept, and everyone's spending a little bit of money here and there, and they're all discussing it, and they're all looking towards it, and they're building solutions for it. But at the end of the day, very little money is currently being spent on consumer mental health and wellness. And so when we say that we're going to, become the dominant platform for improving your mental and cognitive performance and your health and the Fitbit for your brain, they go, okay, I understand that. But if you're, 10% of this $2 billion market, you're just not big enough. If you look right next door, you can see clinical mental health and wellness is like 600 billion, and corporate mental health and wellness is 95 billion. And there's 7 or 8 other adjacent markets that are not Fitbit for your brain, that are not a consumer product, that are not a wellness product and a mental health product, that are just much more attractive industries. And so it's something we're gonna have to think about, do we want to double down and say that this is exactly the product we're building and that we're uncompromising in the vision? Because I truly do believe that there's a incredible amount of value we can add from this product. Or do we want to potentially, pivot it a little bit or sell to a slightly different audience and access a 10 times or 100 times larger market?
Fantastic. So with that being said, I guess when you're talking about the mental health aspect directly with your product, would you consider that your product would fall a line somewhat similar directly to the Muse product that came out a while back, or?
That's another good example of what I was mentioning before, which is I saw the problem that we're solving as being focused particularly. So we're a productivity tool, and you look at the productivity tools and all of that, and that's where we were sizing our market. And at the end of the day, our market, as we get larger, and you imagine okay, we have thousands of customers, get to hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions, the size of the productivity niche ends up becoming smaller, whereas the size of the wellness niche is larger. So the opportunities for us end up entering into the wellness space and the mental health space as a result of that, because as our product grows to service larger audiences and we add features, we add content, we add experiences, we become wellness before we become productivity. And so that was a learning of just I need to think about our product less in terms of the market today, more in terms of the market 5 years from now, where we're $10 billion company. That's the hope, of course. And as a result, we overlap with Muse, I think, a little more than I gave ourselves credit for. I don't think our product is the same. I think I very highly doubt we're going to be substitutable at any point in the near future. But I do think that if you're looking at the total addressable market of consumer health and wellness, we both live in that space.
So at least there is. You always like to compare. So this came out, I think, in 2009. So at least you have somebody there already raised their Series Bs at, I can't remember what series, maybe 13 million or something like that.
But if they're in that market, Series B, and a Series B plus as well.
Yeah. So at least that there is a market, there is somebody out there that, when you're trying to at least compare, at least you have somebody as a target.
Yes and no. Yes, because it gives us a nice growth path. We're okay, well, that's the next 2 years of our life. No, because if we approach an investor and we say, hey, I want to do what they're doing, they'll look at what they're doing and say, but it's not $1 billion though. And not to say that Muse isn't a hugely successful company and that they're not delivering a ton of value to their clients, but they are not Fitbit, they're not Facebook, they're not Peloton, and so it is not a large enough market for us to be able to point to it and say, let's just do that. We need to instead look at them and say, okay, let's do some of that, because I think there's a lot of value there, but we need to circle around it somehow and justify that we aren't gonna, that's not the cap. We need a larger cap.
Like you said, they're onto one thing. They had an idea, but they're not the full idea.
Exactly. And I think that's why, I don't doubt that they're thinking about these problems too, right? And that they're doing their own analysis and that they're going to come out with some really cool stuff as time evolves.
Perfect. Well, I guess just to sum everything up right now, if you had one piece of advice directly to impart, so this is your part right now as a founder going, man, if I had to impart one piece of advice on fellow founders, onto my friends, anybody else that's looking to start a business, what would you like to say? Maybe top three things that you could basically say, okay, number one, do this, 2, 3, 4. What would you like to impart? What kind of wisdom?
If you'd asked me a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I had much clearer answers. It's very fuzzy right now for a lot of reasons that I don't think are necessary to get into. But I more and more as the company grows and as things get more complex and more nuanced and we tackle problems that I never could have possibly seen coming, I'm appreciating the fact that nothing I say to any founder would matter so long as I'm talking tangibly. If I'm saying, for example, do this, for example, the advice I gave on the fundraise, you need to know these things and go, I could tell you to read venture deals because you should, and you should absolutely know that information. But at the end of the day, that is the foundation. That's the building block. But everything that matters is on top of that. And so the advice I would give is, know what you're getting into. It's a long haul and you're expected to be working on this for, 5 to 10 years. And treat yourself with the respect that longevity deserves. You are, by far the most valuable asset for your company. And if you don't take your physical health seriously, your mental health seriously, if you don't become very, very cognizant of where your failures are as a founder and where your strengths are, and align yourself so that you're building towards those and hiring people to help you with the other ones, it just won't scale. You'll never get to the point where you can cover all of those bases and be perfect. Generic as hell advice, and that's why I say it's most fuzzy, is that I don't think that's very actionable. I don't think it's very helpful advice. But I think that any of the tangible advice I could give of like, read this book, talk to this person, know this fact, and understand these assumptions about your business, just don't matter nearly as much as having a founder who is ready for the longevity of what they're about to take on and able to take care of themselves along the way, so that 5 years later, they're still just as excited about it as day one.
That's actually a good piece of advice, because again, it is a long haul.
Yep, and it will suck at certain times. And that reasonably, seen through the lens of fundraising in particular, right? There is nobody I've ever met that comes out of a fundraise and says, man, that was great. Can we do it again? It is terrible. You'll get rejected left, right, and center. And the only thing that will save you from it is, knowing yourself and putting in place the habits so that you can thrive regardless of the fact that your job's going to suck. And so it, like I said, it's very generic. I don't think it's very practical for most people to put into practice. But take yourself seriously and know how you need to live your life in order to be able to thrive, so that when things are very difficult, you can thrive.
That's a good piece of advice. Now, talking about your fundraising, I guess one question I would have right now, if you, or when you are fundraising, or in the past or currently right now, is it something that you do currently yourself, so that you have your co-founder that currently runs the business, so at least you are able to completely focus, or is that something that you do in tandem with your co-founder? I'm just trying to figure out how you kind of work the deal, because again, the business has to still go on, and fundraising takes so much energy directly out of you. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how you balance business and fundraising together.
Yeah, I want quickly just a direct mixed question. So total addressable market is the kind of number that people are looking for, and by which they mean like the market you could literally grow to occupy, right? So like when I talk about consumer mental health and wellness being a $2 billion market, you could never be the entire market, because the market has so many different products in it that you can be all of them. And so you need to take that into account. Your TAM isn't the whole, it's the part that you could, at the biggest possible scale, occupy. But then I was relying on a bottom up. I was saying, how many people could we possibly sell to times the amount that our product is charged? That is our total market. And it turns out it's just way better if you could do it top down. If you could find a paper, like a market analysis, that says, hey, the total market for the thing that you're selling is this much, it's easier to just point to that. So read Peloton's IPO filing. If you just type Peloton IPO SEC into Google, it's like the first link. They do a really good job of showing exactly both the bottom up and the top down of like, this is our market. In general, I find IPO filings to be the best way to understand how you should be doing it, even if you're nowhere near that scale. Back to the fundraise question. So in our case, I've gotten different feedback from different founders. Some of them like to be both co-founders, or sometimes, many co-founders that go fundraising together. I don't think that's worth it. I think on a first call with an investor, being several people is wasteful in my mind. I just don't think that the first calls need it. And in the diligence calls, your co-founder is going to get brought into it anyways. But the vast majority of your time in the fundraise is going to be spent finding the right people, getting connected to them, and doing those first calls. And then, if you have 80 investors that you talk to, 20 will go to the second call and the third call. Your co-founder can join in at that point and provide the expertise and the context that they need for that. So I do it all myself. My co-founder is running. We have a very tangible, several month long offboarding process prior to our fundraises, whereby I will identify, here are the core things that I'm working on right now in the business that I need you to take responsibility for, whether we hire somebody to cover me in it, or whether we give him the responsibility, or whether, we just decide this is not worth doing for the next months. I offboarded myself from running the company so that during the 6 to 8 months of fundraising, I could be 100% dedicated to only fundraising and didn't have to worry about any other part of the business running. And so, for a couple months prior, he learned the things that I was doing, and we'd set up some automation so that I wouldn't have to do it. Then during the 6 months, I put 100% of my time every single day into just fundraising. I would leverage him every once in a while for some extra resources. If I still to this day, if I have to send a really complicated email, I'll just send it to him in chat, be like, hey man, can you just give this a glance over just for, emotional context to know if this is going to be the right phrasing of it. But generally put, it was my responsibility. And I find that better. I can become an expert in fundraising if it's all I'm doing and if I'm 100% involved in it. If you try to slice the fundraising in half, you're either going to have some redundancy or you're going to have some liability where some of you know some things, some of you know others, and you don't have enough communication for you to either of you to be really good at it. So that was the approach that we took. I don't think it's right for everybody. It especially might not be right for a very, very early stage pre-seed company. And it probably isn't right for a very late stage growth company either, where the CFO can be much more involved in the fundraising as an active process. But in that kind of middle seed stage, the investors expect the CEO to be doing it. And I don't think most companies can handle doing it without a full-time investment for that 6 months.
That's a great question. I'm happy that our great answer. I mean, one of the problems we've had before, one of the problems we've had before with some of the founders is it was the focus. If the team was too small, it was how can they separate themselves away from the business long enough to actually concentrate themselves and focus on the fundraising. And the issue is sometimes they just couldn't. So they would have to wait a little bit longer until they actually had enough bandwidth where they could actually say, okay, can I devote 8 hours or 10 hours a day just on the fundraising and then continue on either on the operational part, either later on in the evening or whatever else. But what can I do just to start the process?
Yep. And we noticed it during our first fundraise. I didn't take seriously enough that they were telling me you need to dedicate 100% of your time to this. And I was like, well, I could just, I can run the sales and marketing team and I can help a little bit on the software and the product. And I will, take care of the operational stuff like the financials every month. Okay. And I'll do the fundraise. And then your fundraise takes a hit. There's no two ways about it, right? I was working 7 days a week at the time. To compensate. And it was not a healthy schedule and ended up burning myself out because of it. So this fundraise, we were much more dedicated to making sure we ran a good process because I also think that there's an exponential nature to it, right? If you're able to dedicate all of your time to it, you will have an intensity in the conversations that you're having with investors and a fluency with which you can communicate your ideas that won't happen by having the same amount of fundraise time spread thinner through 12 months instead of 6. So yeah, I recommend offboard yourself from everything that you're doing and give yourself 100% for the entire time it takes.
Fantastic. So it's almost like the same thing when you're doing a sales call. It's you end up getting into that pitch, you're doing it over and over and over. So when you first start for, let's say, the first week, or as I'm talking right now, I'm just mumbling, but at the end of that conversation, you get so fluid, you get into the groove, you're able to answer all the questions, you know the answers ahead of time, what they're going to ask, you know how to respond to it, as opposed to sitting there and you're caught off guard.
Yeah, and some of the really intangible layers, I noticed this fundraise is there would be some sentences where I would have a specific intonation on one word, where if I had that intonation, they went, oh my goodness, and they responded to it. If I didn't have it, it fell flat. And it's so subtle. And it sounds dumb because if you were to tell somebody that, you're like, really, that's going to make the difference? I don't think that matters. And it's true, but it so helps to be able to dedicate 100% of yourself to it because you'll be better at it. And if you're better at it, you're going to do a better job. The reality is it's not always possible. And like I said, like you mentioned, it's a lot of the very, very early stage companies that sometimes they can't afford to do it. We made that mistake too. And I think it is a mistake. And so it's worth recognizing at the very least, look, this is the wrong way to do this fundraise, but might be the only way. And you have to make that decision yourself as a company, right?
Perfect. So this is a perfect time actually for the Q&A. So I know Mike, you had might have some other questions. There's Mike and Tavneer. I just want to know if anybody else has any other questions. This is a perfect time to ask.
I stole a whole bunch of them already, so we might have jumped the gun on the Q&A.
This is fine. I mean, that's the beauty of actually having a smaller event. Just to jump on in, or we can just do this afterwards during the networking
someone earlier,
session.
Mike asked about the accelerators that we went through. So the first one was the Next 36. They, at the time, had a very strong pitch where they said, we essentially accept individuals, not teams, not companies, not ideas. Where they said, like, our goal is to foster your development as an entrepreneur as the primary goal for the program. And then the secondary goal for the program is if you can make a great company and sell it and make some money back, that's cool too. But it wasn't like Founder Fuel or like Y Combinator, where their goal is to make money on you as a company, right? They're an investment fund. And I really loved that thesis. I really like the idea of, look, like, you know, we didn't even have a company or an idea or anything at the time. And I just saw it kind of as a personal development program, like, you know, a little mini MBA I could do. So that was why that fit. And then when it came to, once we graduated from that, we had, you know, some of the ideas about what we're doing, the technology was somewhat proved out. What we needed then was help. And the help was primarily on the hardware. And so HAX is the world's largest hardware accelerator. They show you how to use the Shenzhen manufacturing ecosystem to your advantage. And that just was such a strong alignment for us, right?
Fantastic. I think Tavneer actually has a question as well, if you want to read it.
Yes, is it possible to integrate my technology as an add-on to existing headphones? It is. It's always possible, right? The problem is, it's the Apple problem is the way I describe it, right? Like, there's a reason that Apple brags about the fact that they can integrate, you know, hardware and software and services all as one. And it kind of like the Silicon Valley stereotype. It sounds like a stereotype. You're like, you know, you're just being Apple. But the reality is it was a lot easier for us to design a headphone than it was to design something that would work on every headphone. Like the on-ears, the over-ears, big clunky ones, and really, really tiny slim ones, earbuds. Like, it was really hard to make a good experience without saying, you know what, we need to control every facet of it. And so our number one priority with the first version of the product was we need to deliver a good product. And we couldn't get to the point where we could make a good product that existed on every other thing. Kind of for the same reason that I think it'd be really tough for Fitbit to make something that just exists as a slide under your existing watch. I think it's way tougher to do. So in theory, it is possible and still something that we're considering. But to do it properly, we had to control the whole experience. It's not trivial to get the sensors to work on any other headband.
Perfect. And Mick has a question about VCs.
Yes. Are VCs more enthusiastic about B2B SaaS or B2C SaaS, or does it not matter as long as the software itself has the potential to be the backbone of a billion-dollar company? In my experience, B2B SaaS tends to be higher demand from VCs than B2C SaaS. And the reason is somewhat obvious. It's that consumers are very fickle in terms of how they relate to their technology. So, like, you know, you could have a company pop up that does the same thing as you, that has a slightly stronger brand, and they'll jump ship because they like that brand more than they like yours. You know, the example of Teams beating out, Zoom's beating out Skype. Zoom was not a better product. It just attracted a level of, you know, fanaticism about it. I think that stole the audience. And so B2B is a more reliable sales driver. Like, if you can go to a company and say, hey, want to spend $1,000 to make 10,000? They'd be like, all right, sure. There's no reason not to buy your product. That said, not nearly as differentiated. Like, B2C SaaS will work in a lot of cases with a lot of VCs. The hardware software boundary is a little harder to cross. There are more VCs that hate hardware than there are VCs that hate consumer. We, unfortunately, are in both the consumer and the hardware, and so most VCs hate us. But yeah, there's a little more tendency to go towards B2B, but I wouldn't say that is a big enough driver to determine your market or to determine your product. You should, I tell people, don't do hardware. Like, if you can find any possible way to not do hardware, you should, because you're making your life a lot more difficult by doing it. We absolutely would not do hardware if we could do what we wanted to any other way. That isn't true in the B2B, B2C space. If you are choosing between those based on the VCs, that's the wrong way to be making a decision. Whereas that's not necessarily the case with the hardware.
Perfect.
Mike, at what point in your crowdfunding campaign did you realize you need to do the marketing properly? 6 months prior. is when we realized it. So we didn't plan and execute the campaign and then ramp up the marketing. We designed the entire campaign experience down to like a fanatical level. We went on a PR tour pitching to media companies like The Verge and Mashable and a whole bunch that wrote articles about us exactly a week prior to our campaign. And you tell them up front, you say, hey, we're launching on this day at 8 a.m. You are not allowed to release your article before then, and you have to release it within 3 hours of our campaign launch. Because what we need is a lot of traction right up front, and those articles will bring a lot of snowball effect so that the campaign rises on day one, so that there's a lot of energy, so that it continues very well. The precision with which we executed the Kickstarter, I think, is reflective of a proper go-to-market marketing campaign. And so we could not have executed on the campaign we did if we hadn't planned that for 6 months prior. The most challenging part, knowing what to do, because there's no way I could have done it myself. Like at the end of the day, there are some parts of the company that I still operate in that I am doing it, and I'm like, I am not an expert, but I think I'm good enough. Like, I read a book on it, and I've been doing it for a few months, and so I feel confident. And there will continue to be cases in the company where I'm like, you look around and there's nobody in your company that knows how to do it. You don't have budget to hire someone, and so you're like, I think I can figure it out, right? The marketing strategy for our campaign launch was not one of those. I could not have done it. And so we needed to find a team that knew how to execute on that. And so of the 6 months of planning, half of that was dedicated to just finding the team that we were going to use to go together. And then they taught us how to do it, not vice versa. And so that was, I think, that the biggest benefit we got. We worked with experts who were well qualified in the area.
That's
great.
great.
Can you product target both B2B and B2C? Are there companies that do both? Yeah, technically we do both, right? Right now we sell our product as a Fitbit for your brain. You or I could go on our website, buy it, you'll ship in 2 days, and you'll get a product. And it is, at the end of the day, a consumer experience, because only one person at a time can wear a headphone and sense their brain and get the value from it. Same with Fitbit, right? Like at the end of the day, someone is wearing your wearable and getting all the value from it. And so it is a B2C product at its core. Doesn't mean you can't have B2B distribution as a large part of your go-to-market strategy. So selling to companies does not necessarily mean that companies are buying it as a B2B entity. They call that sometimes B2B2C. Facebook's a good example, right? They're a B2C product, but all their money's made B2B. So the simplicity ruins the details. Like there's nuance in there when you're constructing a marketing strategy, a go-to-market strategy that is worth considering. And the B2C, B2B line is gray in many interesting markets. I would say most companies that are deeply successful do so through one core business strategy. And so you could have a strategy that incorporates, sales from these people, but marketing to these people, or we could sell it to companies who buy it for their employees. That's a B2B2C. There are a lot of different flavors of that. But it's unlikely that you will become hugely successful by saying, well, 3/4 of our sales are going to be B2C, a quarter is going to be B2B, and both are equally viable markets. What would be more likely is an investor would look at that and say, okay, get rid of the quarter and keep the 3/4 and double down on that, because it's just unlikely that you're going to do two things that are completely orthogonal at a world-class level at the same time. It's probably worth focusing on one or the other.
Great answer. All right, guys, any other questions? Keep on going. Keep on coming. Otherwise, we're just going to jump on
that
in.
Also is that I come from an engineering background, not a marketing background. So I actually am not the most qualified person to be commenting on go-to-market strategies, but hopefully what I mumbled was valuable nonetheless.
Hey, not mumbling, man. It's fantastic. It's all fantastic nuggets. Here's another question directly from Mick.
What's the best way to find a co-founder? For example, if an idea and basic knowledge of the technological side, I have a really good startup knowledge, but by no means really good technically. I don't know. The reality is there are some things in the business that we've had to do 3, 4, 5, 6 times that I'm starting to develop a confidence that I could give really good advice on. So like the marketing strategy, I've spent probably a year of full-time effort thinking about it. So I have some thoughts and some nuance. I found a co-founder once, and he was a friend of mine from university. So I don't know. The reality is, so let's start with the fundamentals, right? Your co-founder is a marriage. Like you're getting into bed with somebody that you were going to build an entire business with for many, many, many years. Know that and treat it with the intensity that it deserves as a result, right? While at the same time, completely the opposite, if you structure yourselves well and you put vesting on your equity so that your equity that you get in the company vests over 4 years with a 1-year cliff, that means nobody actually gets their equity without having put a year into the business. And so within a year, you could break up and separate as co-founders, and there's not that much risk. So both of those are, equally true. It's very, very important to find somebody that you're in a long-term relationship with, while at the same time, you can protect yourself so that if it doesn't work out, you're okay. Secondly, the parts that are going to matter from a development standpoint, like the things that have been most valuable in my relationship with my co-founder, will likely have nothing to do with the things that you think they will, and they'll likely have nothing to do with anything that you could test up front, unfortunately. So the most valuable part of my relationship with my co-founder is the way that we think differently. I'm very analytical. He's very hands-on. I'm very, cold and linear. He's very emotional and humanistic. And as a result, we complement each other on a operational standpoint, so that even if we're both working on the same task, we're going to bring very, very different values to it. That took us like 3 years to realize. Like, I don't think we could have known that up front in any way that would have been valuable. We actually come from the same background. Both of us are mechanical engineers, but that didn't end up mattering because I was able to learn a lot of the business skills. He was able to learn a lot of the software skills. And so we were able to specialize in the ways that were meaningful to us, where the upfront knowledge that we brought to the table wasn't nearly as valuable as what we could have learned along the way. So that's I think my asterisk on the fact that I think there's a lot to consider, and I haven't figured out a framework to consider it. The piece of advice I would give is interesting people tend to attract interesting people, and you want interesting people on your team. You want to be working with someone who is interesting and interested in a lot of stuff. Because they tend to be, A quality players, and I don't think you can get by in building a really successful company with a B quality team, in particular in your co-founding team. Not true of everybody else. And so the best way, I think, is go find where interesting and interested people are hanging out and talk to as many of them as possible, and befriend a network of people that you can trust and rely upon, and ask them, do you know anyone who's looking for a gig? At the end of the day, my co-founder was, ready to apply to med school, and I had to convince him to drop that to come in the business. But not everyone's going to be at that stage, and not everyone's going to be, ready to drop it. And so you're going to have to probably meet a lot of freaking people before you find the right co-founder. And so network is the best advice I could give. So unfortunately, again, it's a terrible answer. I acknowledge that, and I apologize for it, but it's probably the toughest question. And it's unfortunately something that most entrepreneurs only do once or twice. And so you won't find very many people that have an incredible answer to it. Yes, my co-founder is David Doyle.
Very insightful answer.
Cool. Tanvir, if you want to be a guinea pig now, is still a great time. Now we have an actual product for you to guinea pig on.
There you go. All right, guys, any other questions going around? Come on. We have a few more minutes before we jump into open networking. Have the answer. Come on. This is time for the Q&A. Going once, going twice. Don't be shy, otherwise it's gone. Oh, here he comes.
All right. What did the accelerators teach me via the teaching? So the part, depending on the accelerator, the earlier stage it is, the more they will have a, micro MBA or startups 101 kind of like course structure, and they'll teach you the fundamentals. So, the biggest of which are like the legals of your company, like the fact that, every employee should have a transfer of IP agreement signed before they ever join your company. And you should have vesting on your equity, like the really fundamentals of the legal structure that you're going to acquire for your company. They'll usually go through that. The fundraising process is another one. The idea of VCs will only invest in VC fundable billion-dollar opportunities. They don't invest in small opportunities. The fact that, this is the process you should run. You need this many VCs in the top of your funnel to be able to meet this many, to be able to convert this many. So those are the biggest takeaways I have. And then they'll often have a third component, which is some flavor of strategy, like the way you should be thinking about MVPs and testing, about KPIs, about go-to-market, about all of that. That tends to be a little more generic. That'll be about half of it, especially the early stage incubators will have those factual knowledges. And I'd say that the legals and the fundraising ones are the ones that stuck with me. I can still remember those courses, whereas a lot of the strategy ones, maybe they apply, maybe they don't, but you tend to forget them. The other part of that they'll do is they'll often work with you specifically on your company, because the reality is that most of what you're going to face can't be taught in a generic fashion in a classroom. And so they'll ask you what your problems are currently facing. They will give you advice in ways that you probably won't see coming. So you'll say, I'm working on this, working on that. And then they'll say, but have you tested this assumption? You're like, well, no, I don't think I need to. And then they go, yeah, you do. And that will be, a really valuable piece of learning that you can then go and integrate into your game plan. So the mentorship that comes with it, the actual working on your business specifically, I think is the other big part, and usually is the majority of the value, especially if you're relatively fluent in the fundamentals of startups. That's where most of the value comes from. And then some will have very specific stuff. So like Hacks had a whole process on, leveraging manufacturing ecosystems in Shenzhen and PCB design and DFM, DFA, and a whole bunch of hardware specific stuff that was just for us. What piece of advice would you give to someone who is more into services-based startup in terms of finding new clients, especially when we're inclined towards technical side? Services as in like consulting, and as in, somebody comes to you with a problem, you help deliver the service on it on a one-to-one basis, not a SaaS product that you're selling. Consulting, yeah. Brian, you might have an example counterpoint to this, but I've never seen a VC fundable service-based startup. I think that they're more lifestyle business, and therefore I think it's a slightly different game. I just want to make sure that that context is set.
There is a few, but they're few and far between. You really have to. It really becomes on the size of the market, where you are, what you're doing, and it really depends on the interest level again of the VC, and it's really more under who the investor is when it comes down more under the angel side and how big the fund is. Less on a true VC, but then again,
not to say you can't,
if you're big,
can't raise equity, but I don't think it's usually VC fundable. So, but my recommendation: go Google venture capital math or VC math, VC economics, some flavor of that, and read the articles about the reason why VCs will only invest in billion-dollar businesses. You need to know that to decide: are you a $10, $100 billion opportunity that VCs will be willing to invest in, or are you without any derogatory connotation to it, a small business, like a lifestyle business? And there's no wrong answer, but you need to know that before you start, because that will be the context. If you are in the VC category, I can give some advice towards it. If you're more of a lifestyle business, it's just not my game. I wouldn't suggest, that you take my advice on any of that, because it's so fundamentally different. The concept of, requiring profitability from day one, the concept of organic growth rather than paid growth, it's not the world I live in. And so I don't think I can comment much on it.
Yeah, and
VCs
really
aren't explicitly, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Brad.
I was just going to say, if you have a service business, the only way that it really becomes really attractive, because there is definitely a few. I mean, I know it really comes down to, again, is it a SaaS-based service business? If it is, and how much market traction are you getting? How big you guys are? Some of those will get funded and pretty big, but it's very few and far between.
Yeah. So I would not say, so for example, SaaS is absolutely VC fundable, right? And they're hugely successful SaaS businesses. SaaS businesses view their software as a product. And so they're very, very similar to the way that we view our product as a product. The fact that is providing a service, paid recurring revenue, versus being a hardware product with the software and maybe being paid up front instead of not. Those are nuances that don't play into the larger game of how you're going to structure your funding, your growth, all that kind of stuff. But if you have a services business whereby you are providing one-on-one services, where let's say you hire a bunch of employees, your employees contract out their services, they make $100 an hour for every value that they add. And if you get, 100 new customers, you need to hire X new employees to cover those customers. And it scales linearly, the amount of jobs that you have and the amount of employee hours that need to be put into it. It's not as easily scalable as a SaaS business, and as a result is unlikely to be VC backable. There are, I'm sure, exceptions to that. But it's the reason why no taxi company got huge, crazy VC funding until Uber came. Uber was a SaaS product that could scale infinitely with their software, whereas the other taxi companies required hiring individuals, charging hourly, paying for cars, and it's harder to scale that. If I missed anything there, if I misinterpreted it, let me know, because I kind of went on a tangent that might have not been what you were thinking. Anything else?
I'm actually spinning something right now.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just spinning something right now. So anybody that's looking to learn a little bit more about the SaaS space right now and to learn a little bit more about VCs that like to invest in SaaS, there is a great mentor that really talks about it. His name is Artem Gassan. He is a VC. He's a great VC. He talks quite a bit about that space. He'll talk a little bit about the service space, but really goes a little bit more under the technology. He'll analyze quite a few companies. He dives in. He does a really good deep dive. We've met him directly through the Founders Institute programs and a bunch of other. He mentors in a bunch of other programs as well. Very, very knowledgeable. So if you want to maybe learn a little bit more, I think he also has a SaaS talk show as well. So definitely something to check out a little bit.
Make asking for legal advice, hashtag not legal advice. So yeah, caveat, I am not a lawyer. I don't play one on the internet. So don't trust me on any of this. But my legal advice, I think there were like 4 things, because I gave a talk on this at some point. Number 1 was get vesting on your equity. Make sure that the moment anybody has any equity in the company, there is a vesting agreement with it, because you do not want to get caught in a situation where a week into your contract, someone's like, I'm sorry, it's just not a nice fit, but they technically own 20% of your company. Like that, you do not want to get caught in that situation. So vesting on your equity, and almost always 4-year vest, 1-year cliff. Number 2, every employee, every contractor, every advisor, every consultant, everyone who ever touches your company should sign a transfer of IP, because again, you can kind of get screwed in that. Like, it's one of those things, you forget to do it with one person who works with you early on, and then 10 years later you're IPOing and he's like, oh, by the way, I own all your core technology. So that was number 2. Number 3 was I just don't care about NDAs. NDAs are kind of ridiculous, and especially early stage, they're just almost never, the asterisk on there, almost never going to matter, with the exception of when other people get you to sign NDAs, because that can sometimes matter. Don't sign NDAs that you're going to be talking about something that's meaningful to your company, because if you go and consult with somebody, you sign an NDA, he tells you something you already know and were considering working on and want to work on, it's now covered under NDA and you now can't use it. And so you can get screwed in some other cases, again, where like you meet with some other company who's in your space, you're chatting, shooting the shit, you signed an NDA prior, he tells you a great idea and you're like, damn, I was gonna do that, but now technically it's under NDA and I can't. So that was number 3. And then number 4 is like, just acknowledge in the legal space, especially early on, that you can't afford it. And so, you get a great patent and then Apple goes and does something that conflicts with your patent and you're going to lose. You can't fight them. You can't afford to do it. And so just keep that in mind with legal stuff. The best legal protection you could get in the very early stages is executing very effectively on growing your company, so that you have, market traction, product traction, defensibility, and that you're, keeping up. because most of the time when you rely on IP protection or legal protection as your defensibility, when push comes to shove, you're just not going to be able to enforce it because you don't have the money. Great examples. We had a trademark on one of our old logos and we got sued by a company. We had the trademark, they didn't. They sued us over our logo and said, you stole it from us. We didn't, and I didn't even know who the company was. But we lost because we had to give up, because after $20,000 of legal fees, we were like, this is not worth our time. And so most of the time, the moment you get lawyers involved, you already lost. So that's my 4 pieces of I'm not a lawyer legal advice.
You did damn good though.
Thank you. I do damn good until someone follows that advice and they do something and they get a lot of trouble because I shouldn't be giving legal advice. So that's the asterisk on it. Don't follow my advice.
Fantastic, everybody. If anybody else has any other questions, this is a perfect time to actually just network, and you can ask Jacob directly through the networking session. You can do the speed networking, you can meet him, join him at a table, whatever you basically feel like. This is basically your time. We're trying to use this application just like you would be meeting each other directly in person, at one of our events. Normally you would be doing that either with a beer or with a coffee, with a bottle of water, whatever.
Oh,
we can't do that now. So yeah, no kidding. So at least this way you can do this in the comfort of your own home. You can still kind of mingle as much as you can. So do what you can. So thank you so much for coming out, guys. This will go on for at least another half an hour. Enjoy yourself as much as you can. Like I said, next week, there's going to be another event on how to create an MVP, followed in 2 more weeks with another event by Good News Ventures on funding as well. And Jacob, that's a connection I want to make a connection with you as well by a gentleman by the name of Mohan. So yes, I'll reach out directly
to Mohan a few times.
Perfect. He's a good friend.
So, I threw my email address in the chat. If any of you are interested, I love mentorship opportunities. I don't know how much I can offer to any of you, but if you think that I can help in any capacity, please just reach out by email and I'll be happy to help.
Fantastic. Hey, everybody, take Jacob on it. It's going to be fantastic. He's full of knowledge, let me tell you. Okay, with that being said, thank you guys so much.